Well, if they're going to get the information from DeFreeze and ignore you, they obviously, it feels a little bit like they maybe know the answer they want written,
Right.
and then they go and write the answers
It's
they want.
selective. I know they have been talking to other Bitcoiners too, so they have been doing some diligence. They did have some parts of the report that were echoed things that Bitcoiners have said, especially about flare gas and using renewables and things like that. So they're not completely unaware of what Bitcoiners have to say about mining. They're just very dismissive of those things. So Biden commissioned the report, and then it kind of looked like they did this in a hurry, to be honest with you. It didn't seem as rigorous as I would have expected. And basically, they're just talking through the state of affairs, the status quo with Bitcoin mining, especially in the US, and then repeating a lot of the same talking points that we see, the critical ones. And basically, they disparage a lot of the mitigating factors that Bitcoiners like to bring up about mining. And they repeat a lot of hostile academia. They don't do a lot of original research of their own. That was one thing that disappointed me. And they also then basically conclude by sort of broadcasting extremely high standards for what Bitcoin miners should do in terms of being like benign consumers of energy, which are standards I've not seen, mentioned for any other industry. And then they also mentioned some possible ways to tackle Bitcoin mining in the industry, including possible legislation, possible bans, things like that.
How much do we know about their strategy with regards to energy and climate? Have they set any specific goals?
Well, there's the ESG movement, which the Biden administration is completely on board with. Basically involves waging political warfare on oil and gas producers. So through a variety of methods, they've made it difficult for, in particular, oil and gas companies to operate for firms that would be fracking and producing natural gas to produce that natural gas, right? They did this for the first 2 years of the admin, and then now we're in the energy crisis, and now it's more important than ever that we drill, that we produce natural gas, and we ship it to Europe, which is in the midst of a much worse energy crisis. But because of the administration's reticence to sort of support the fossil industry, for better or for worse, now there's a production crisis. And so instead of encouraging domestic production, there's so many things they could have done. They could have allowed pipeline construction. They could have done more permitting for natural gas. They could have not waged war through the SEC, through the financial sector on these public companies that are exploring and penetrating these wells. Now they're going to places like Venezuela and asking and lifting sanctions on Venezuela and asking for them to produce. They're going to Saudi Arabia and they're begging them. Embarrassing, in my opinion. They're begging Saudi Arabia to increase production. They're begging OPEC to increase production. It's not working. OPEC is cutting production. We have an incredible abundance of energy in this country, and it's not really being taken advantage of. Instead, we're in a weaker position. We're having to go to countries that don't like us very much and beg them to increase production. Meanwhile, Europe is in the midst of a horrible energy crisis. We're basically bailing them out with liquid natural gas shipments from America, relatively cheap gas, which we are liquefying, shipping to Europe, and helping them with their problems. The admin could have done a lot more, and the general trend from the Obama admin through now has been to marginalize the American energy sector. The other thing is there's been a ton of tax subsidies for wind and solar, which I support the emergence of wind and solar 100%, but it has meant that certain grids have become unbalanced. So they're very beholden to whether it's windy or not. And that has left them in a weaker state. So Texas, California, New England is also in a kind of a bad state. These are places where the grids are performing less than optimally partly because there's been insufficient pipelines built, but also because there's been a huge emergence of subsidy-fed wind and solar, which isn't sort of bad on its own, but it does mean that it's harder to balance the grid. So it's been a kind of anti-energy administration so far from Biden. That's the general thrust of what they're doing. Now they're sort of trying to pivot a little bit.
Anti-energy or anti-fossil fuel?
Yeah, and anti is sort of like thermal energy,
Yeah.
thermal generation. There hasn't been a big emphasis on nuclear, unfortunately. It's not like nuclear would solve our problems overnight because it takes so long, but there's been a lack of emphasis on nuclear. I don't think there's been a new nuclear plant in the U.S. permitted since like the 70s or something unbelievable in a long time. And so there's a lot they could have done, which would have, mitigated the energy crisis we find ourselves in and lessened our dependence on Venezuelans and Saudis and things like that. But it seems like they are now realizing politically it's infeasible to have gas at $7 a gallon in this country. And have these grids start to fail. So there might be an evolution in their tactics, but the general messaging has been, pretty hostile to fossil fuels. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not like an Alex Epstein kind of guy where it's.
What do you make of him?
I think I read his book. I think it's actually useful to have a perspective like that.
Agreed.
I don't agree fully with his view. I'm more of a moderate. Put me in like the Troy Cross camp, I do think we need an energy transition, but I think it's been done in an imprudent way. And I don't necessarily believe that we can follow the track that we're on in terms of encouraging tons of wind and solar and batteries and have that be sufficient. I'm not sure that's going to work in sort of the current way it's envisioned. It's causing issues here in Europe, California, Texas. So we do need thermal energy to tide us over. And because it's been a rushed transition, we're now resorting back to coal, which is totally a step in the wrong direction. Natural gas is much better than coal in terms of its emissions profile. We didn't encourage it enough. And now you're seeing globally a ton of dependence on coal. In New England, they could have built pipelines from these incredibly rich shale deposits that are nearby. Instead, they're importing gas from Africa. They're burning oil, which is worse. So I just think there's been a lack of prudence and a lack of sort of long-term thinking on this, or maybe a utopianism in terms of thinking the green transition can happen on this schedule. I think it still can happen, but it's probably been too aggressive is my view.